On the 10th of March, 1876, a young man in a laboratory in Boston spoke into a device and said something that would be quoted in every history book for the next 150 years. "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." Thomas Watson, his assistant, was in the next room. He heard the words clearly, through a wire, through a device that had never before transmitted a human voice. He ran down the hall. The experiment had worked. Alexander Graham Bell had invented the telephone. Except, 2 hours before Bell filed his patent that morning, another man had walked into the same patent office in Washington with the same idea. His name was Elisha Gray. He was an experienced inventor, well-funded, backed by Western Union, the most powerful communications company in America. His design was different from Bell's in some ways, similar in others. He arrived 2 hours later. 2 hours. And he lost. But that is not even the deepest part of the story, because there was a third man, older than both of them, poorer than both of them, a man who had been working on the problem of transmitting the human voice through a wire for more than 15 years before either Bell or Gray filed a single document. A man who had tried repeatedly to register his invention with the patent office, and who had been stopped each time not by a superior competitor, but by a filing fee he could not afford. His name was Antonio Meucci, and the United States Congress formally acknowledged in the year 2002 that he was the true inventor of the telephone. To understand what the telephone meant, you have to understand the world it entered. By the 1870s, human beings had already achieved something that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. They had learned to send messages faster than any horse could carry them. The telegraph, invented in the 1830s and 1840s and expanded rapidly through the American Civil War, had wired the continent. By 1866, a transatlantic cable connected Europe and North America. A message that once took weeks to cross an ocean now arrived in minutes. This was extraordinary, and it was also deeply limited. The telegraph sent dots and dashes, coded signals that had to be translated at both ends by trained operators. You could not simply speak into a telegraph. You wrote a message, gave it to an operator who encoded it, who sent it to another operator who decoded it, who delivered it to the recipient. The process was fast by the standards of 1870, but it was not personal. It was not immediate. It was not the sound of a human voice. What people wanted, what engineers and inventors across Europe and America were beginning to think about in the 1860s, was the ability to do with sound what the telegraph had done with dots and dashes. To send not a coded message, but a voice. To speak to someone in another city as if they were in the same room.
The idea had a name.
People called it the speaking telegraph. The question was not whether it was possible. The question was how. Antonio Meucci was born in Florence in 1808, in a city that still remembered the Renaissance, in a family with no particular wealth and no particular connections. He trained as a mechanical engineer, worked in theater, and in 1835 moved to Havana, Cuba, where he and his wife Esther spent 15 years. In Havana, Meucci worked as a technical director for a theater company. He was resourceful, creative, and fascinated by electricity. He used electrotherapy, mild electrical currents applied to the body, to treat patients, which was a common practice of the era. And during one of these treatments, around 1849, he noticed something. The patient was in one room. Meucci was in another, preparing the electrical equipment. When the current passed through the wire connecting the two rooms, Meucci heard a sound coming from the receiver end, a sound produced by the patient. The vibration of the voice somehow carried by the current along the wire. He stopped. He listened. He understood what had happened. He had not intended it. He had not been looking for it. But in that moment, in a Havana room in 1849, Antonio Meucci heard the first hint of what would eventually become the telephone. He began to investigate, to experiment, to build. Over the next several years, Meucci constructed a series of devices that could transmit voice sounds through a wire. He called them by various names. Teletrofono was one. He tested them in his home, in the theater, across distances. By 1860, he had demonstrated his device publicly in New York, where he had moved with Esther after leaving Cuba. He wrote about it in an Italian-language newspaper called L'Eco d'Italia. The article described a device that transmitted voice sounds electrically over a wire. The date was 1860. Bell was 16 years old, but Meucci was poor. He was an Italian immigrant in a country that did not always look kindly on Italian immigrants. He spoke limited English. He had no wealthy backers, no university connections, no access to the circles of power where inventions became products. And in 1870, a crisis took everything he had left. His wife Esther became severely ill, a debilitating condition that left her bedridden for years. Meucci, caring for her, was himself badly injured in a boiler explosion on a Staten Island ferry. Burned, partially disabled, financially ruined, he could no longer work at full capacity. He filed what was called a caveat, not a full patent, but a formal notice to the patent office that he was working on a specific invention in 1871. A caveat had to be renewed every year at a cost of $10. $10 was not a trivial sum for a man in Meucci's circumstances. He renewed it in 1872. He renewed it in 1873. In 1874, he could not afford the renewal fee. The caveat lapsed. Alexander Graham Bell was born in Edinburgh in 1847, the same year as Thomas Edison, the same year the telegraph was beginning to reshape the world. His family had a deep connection to the science of sound. His grandfather had been a speech teacher. His father, Melville Bell, had developed a system called visible speech, a phonetic notation designed to help deaf people learn to speak. His mother was deaf. Sound was not an abstract interest for Bell. It was personal. It was the medium through which his family worked, taught, and communicated. He grew up thinking about how voices worked, why some people could hear and others could not, and how the mechanics of speech might be represented, reproduced, transmitted. Bell came to America in 1870, initially following his father's work. He settled in Boston, became a professor of vocal physiology at Boston University, and began working with deaf students, work that would occupy him for his entire life, and that he considered in many ways more important than the telephone. He became interested in the telegraph, and specifically in the problem of sending multiple messages simultaneously over a single wire, what engineers called the harmonic telegraph, or the multiple telegraph. It was a commercially valuable problem. Western Union, which controlled most of American telegraphy, was extremely interested in anyone who could solve it. Bell's work on the multiple telegraph led him, gradually and somewhat accidentally, towards something larger. If you could transmit multiple tones simultaneously over a wire, could you transmit sound itself? Not coded signals, not dots and dashes, but actual sound waves, the full complexity of a human voice. He became convinced the answer was yes. What Bell had that Meucci did not was infrastructure. He had a financial backer, a wealthy Boston lawyer named Gardner Hubbard, whose deaf daughter Belle was teaching. And he had a skilled electrician named Thomas Watson, who could turn his ideas into working apparatus. He had access to the Boston scientific community, to legal advice, to the machinery of the patent system. He also had urgency. He knew he was not alone. Elisha Gray was everything Bell was not in terms of experience. Gray was 40 years old in 1876, a decade older than Bell. He was a professional inventor with a successful track record. He had already developed several telegraph improvements and was a co-founder of what would become Western Union's manufacturing arm. He was methodical, well-funded, respected in the industry. He had been working on the harmonic telegraph problem at the same time as Bell, and he too had begun to see that the same principles might allow the transmission of actual voice. He had built a device he called a liquid transmitter, a concept that used the varying resistance of a liquid to convert sound vibrations into electrical signals. On the 14th of February, 1876, both men were ready to file. Bell's lawyer, acting on Bell's behalf, arrived at the patent office in Washington at 11:49 in the morning. He filed the patent application for Bell's telephone. Elisha Gray arrived at approximately 2 in the afternoon. He filed what was called a caveat, a notice of intent to file a full patent, similar to the document Meucci had used 5 years earlier. He was 2 hours behind Bell's lawyer. 2 hours. The patent was issued to Bell on March 7, 1876. 3 days later, Bell spoke those famous words to Watson. Gray contested the patent. The legal battle that followed was enormous, one of the most complex patent disputes in American history, involving hundreds of lawsuits over nearly 2 decades. Many of the cases turned on questions of priority, of who had conceived the idea first, of what the patent office clerks had done and when. During the litigation, deeply troubling questions emerged about the process itself. Examiners who had handled both filings gave contradictory testimony. There were accusations that details from Gray's caveat had been improperly shared with Bell's team before the patent was finalized. A patent office employee was alleged to have accepted a bribe. An internal investigation was opened. Nothing was ever conclusively proven. What was conclusively proven was that Bell's application had arrived first. The patent stood. Here is something important and often overlooked. Bell's patent did not describe a working telephone. When he filed it on February 14, 1876, Bell did not have a device that could reliably transmit a human voice. The patent described a principle, a method, for transmitting sounds electrically. The specific technical implementation was still being worked out. The famous demonstration on March 10th, "Mr. Watson, come here," happened 3 weeks after the patent was filed. Some versions of the story suggest that Bell used in that demonstration a liquid transmitter whose design bore a striking resemblance to the one Elisha Gray had described in his caveat filed the same morning. Whether Bell's use of that design was independent parallel development or something more troubling was debated for years. What is not disputed is that Bell moved faster. He filed first. He demonstrated publicly. He built a company. The Bell Telephone Company was incorporated in 1877. By 1880, it was operating telephone exchanges in dozens of American cities. By 1886, over 150,000 Americans had a telephone. By 1900, over 1.5 million. Bell understood what Meucci and Gray had not fully grasped, that the telephone was not just a device, it was a network, and a network's value grows exponentially with the number of people connected to it. Every new customer made the telephone more valuable for every existing customer. The business logic was profound, and Bell, through Hubbard, through careful patent management, through aggressive legal defense, built the infrastructure that turned a laboratory experiment into the central nervous system of modern communication. He was, like Edison with the light bulb, less the inventor of a device than the architect of a system. When Bell's original patents expired in 1893 and 1894, hundreds of independent telephone companies sprang up across America. The period that followed is sometimes called the Golden Age of the telephone, a period of rapid expansion, falling prices, and genuinely competitive innovation. By 1907, there were over 6 million telephones in the United States. All of them descended from a device that at least 3 men, and arguably a 4th and a 5th, had significant claims to having invented. Antonio Meucci did not give up. After his caveat lapsed in 1874, he continued working. He continued trying to interest investors. In 1874, he was introduced to a vice president of Western Union. And here, the story takes another strange turn. Meucci gave the Western Union executive a package of materials, models, technical drawings, and documentation of his device. He was hoping for investment, for partnership, for recognition. Western Union kept his materials for 2 years and then told him they had been lost. 2 years later, Western Union's patent department was working with a young inventor who had recently filed a very promising telephone patent. His name was Alexander Graham Bell. Whether Meucci's materials were truly lost or whether they were seen by people who should not have seen them was never established in court. The circumstantial outline of the story, an immigrant inventor's technical documentation arriving at a company, disappearing, and then a patent emerging from that same company's circle shortly afterward, has been examined by historians for over a century, and no definitive conclusion has ever been reached. What is clear is that Meucci filed a lawsuit in 1887, asserting priority over Bell's patents. The federal government also opened an investigation into possible fraud in the original Bell patent filing. The case was proceeding. The evidence was accumulating. Legal scholars who have studied the surviving documents believe Meucci had a genuine and strong claim. And then, in October 1889, Antonio Meucci died. He was 81 years old. He had spent the last decades of his life in poverty on Staten Island, watching another man become famous and wealthy on the back of something he believed he had invented first. When he died, the lawsuit died with him. With no plaintiff to pursue it, the case was dropped. Bell's patent stood. Bell's name endured. And Meucci's name faded for more than a century. Until June 11, 2002, when the United States House of Representatives passed Resolution 269, formally recognizing that Antonio Meucci had developed a voice communication device before Alexander Graham Bell, and that his work deserved to be acknowledged. It was recognition without restitution, honor without consequence, a correction in the record that changed nothing about the buildings bearing Bell's name, the textbooks, the statues, the mythology. It is easy, with the benefit of 150 years of hindsight, to underestimate what the telephone did to human experience. Before the telephone, communication at a distance was asynchronous. You sent a message, you waited, the reply came back. The exchange happened across time, not across it. Even the telegraph, the fastest communication technology of its era, was a transaction, a request and a response, mediated by operators, structured and formal. The telephone changed the grammar of communication.
For the first time in human history,
Two people in different places could have a conversation, not exchange messages. A conversation, with interruptions, with tone of voice, with the pause and the breath and the feeling behind the words. A mother could hear her child's voice from 100 miles away. A doctor could consult a colleague in another city in real time. A businessman could negotiate a deal without being in the same room. The social consequences were enormous and not entirely anticipated. Privacy changed. The boundary between public and private communication blurred. The separation between workplace and home began, slowly, to dissolve. The pace of business accelerated in ways that surprised even the people driving the acceleration. And none of this, none of the modern world that descended from the telephone, through radio, through television, through the internet, through the device in your pocket right now, none of it would exist in the form it does without the decision made in a Washington patent office on the morning of February 14th, 1876, to process one filing before another. 2 hours. The entire trajectory of modern communication, the technology that connects every human being on the planet who has access to it, rested at one critical moment on a 2-hour gap. And the man who arrived 2 hours too late became a footnote. And the man who had been building the device for 25 years could not afford the $10 renewal fee. Somewhere, right now, someone is making a phone call. Maybe it is a call on a device that has no wires, no operator, no exchange building. A call that travels as data through the air, through satellites, through fiber optic cables that carry light instead of electricity. It bears almost no physical resemblance to the copper wire and membrane and acid-soaked platinum of Bell's original device. The technology has changed beyond recognition. But the experience, two human voices reaching each other across distance in real time, is exactly what Antonio Meucci imagined in a Havana room in 1849. Exactly what Bell demonstrated to Watson on the 10th of March, 1876. Exactly what the world immediately understood it had been waiting for, even before it knew it wanted it. Bell died in 1922, famous, honored, and genuinely beloved. On the day of his funeral, every telephone in North America was silenced for 1 minute in his honor. The silence traveled coast to coast. Millions of people who had never met him stood for a moment in quiet acknowledgement of what his work had given them.
it was an extraordinary tribute.
And it is a measure of how completely the telephone had transformed daily life in less than 50 years that such a tribute was even possible. Gray died in 1901, working to the end, having filed over 70 patents in his lifetime. The telephone eluded him by 2 hours and defined him forever. Meucci died with almost nothing, in a world that was already beginning to fill with the sound of voices traveling through wires. Voices carried by a technology he had first glimpsed in a room in Havana, decades before anyone else had thought to look for it. History remembers Bell because Bell built the system, because Bell filed the papers, because Bell, more than anyone else, turned the telephone from an idea into an industry. But behind the industry, behind the patent, behind the famous words spoken to Watson, there is a longer story. A story of a man who heard a voice through a wire in 1849 and spent the rest of his life trying to show the world what he had heard. The world eventually listened. It just took 150 years.